to the Ministry of Gray, Season 1, Episode 1. And I'm your host, Satan's Little Side Piece. In today's episode, I want to start off with a question. What is an American? I've been really confused on this topic lately. Is it a birthright, an attitude, a belief system? Maybe it's something else entirely. Today, we're unraveling this question while diving into a fundamental tension that defines our nation's identity: freedom of versus freedom from. I'm going to explore how history shows us that freedom of religion, speech, movement requires a robust and firm freedom from oppression, prejudice, and unchecked power. And without the from, the of is easily manipulated and abused. Now, before we dive into the heart of this discussion today, I want to clear up a fundamental misunderstanding that clouds debates on citizenship, religion, and even policymaking in America: the difference between freedom of and freedom from. These concepts sound similar, but they lead us down very different pathways, especially when it comes to defining rights, responsibilities, and the role of our government. Freedom of is all about your ability to practice, express, or pursue a belief, a hobby, whatever, without any undue interference. It's what allows individuals to speak their minds, lets us worship as we choose or decide not to, make personal decisions. Freedom from, on the other hand, is about protection, being free from coercion, discrimination, and harm. It ensures that your rights don't trample over those of another. Maybe you can kind of relate to this example. Imagine that you're living in this apartment building, tons of different families and cultures. Freedom of means that you can decorate your apartment door for Christmas however you like. Host whatever cultural celebrations you want. Practice your faith openly. If you want to stand in the hallway and give your thanks to God before you walk down the stairs to work, go for it. But freedom from means your neighbors can't blast loud music all night or insist that you have to celebrate the same holidays that they do. Both freedoms are necessary, but they operate in tension. They require a balance to ensure everyone's rights are expected. Think about the donut that we've all heard about, this donut example. If you can't have donuts, do you have the right to say everyone else can't have donuts based on your personal, moral, or ethical belief system? Of course not. But this balance is increasingly being overlooked, not just on a social level anymore, on social media and in the news, but in government policymaking. In fact, you'll even see in today's public discourse, freedom of has taken on an air of entitlement, as if it comes with zero responsibilities or consequences. Many of these people are using freedom of as a shield to impose their beliefs or ideological practices on others. And this is often under the guise of exercising their rights. And when you're confronting them with this, asking them to acknowledge that their actions are infringing on someone else's freedom from, they cry oppression. Take the push for public school prayer as an example, or bringing Bibles into the classroom, or displaying the Ten Commandments on the wall because kids don't have enough morals nowadays. Advocates of these policies often frame it as their freedom of religion, but what they're asking for is not merely the right to pray for themselves. It's the institutional endorsement of their faith. This infringes on the rights of students from other belief systems, or in my case, non-belief systems. When challenged, these advocates often portray themselves as victims, as though they're being required to respect diversity as an attack on their personal beliefs. Because if they genuinely want to, protect freedom of, why would they then withdraw measures to allow sharing of the Satanic Bible or even the Gideon's Bible in schools that have the King James Bible wanting to be pushed, right? No, if they can't have just their version of this good book, then nobody can, and they completely wipe away policy altogether. They then weaponize freedom from. And this dynamic is extremely pervasive. Consider businesses refusing service to LGBTQ plus customers under the banner of religious freedom. They demand the right to act on their beliefs, and they're going to completely justify the harm that they will directly cause others. When courts or public opinion push back, they don't see it as a call to equity, but as evidence of their own oppression. This pattern is very clear. The moment their freedom of meets the boundary of equity, many will deflect responsibility and frame themselves as a victim. I think it's pretty clear. This sense of entitlement is warping the meaning of freedom. It's ignoring the truth that rights in a pluralistic society come with a shared obligation to ensure these rights don't infringe on others. Freedom of is not an unlimited pass to do as one pleases. It's a privilege, and it has to coexist with the respect for freedom from. Without that balance, we just don't have liberty. We have a hierarchy where the loudest voices drown out everyone else. Understanding this distinction helps us see how foundational principles like citizenship and religious liberty are framed and often contested. It also brings us to a critical question. When policies are justified using religious rhetoric, whose freedom are we really prioritizing? Whose values are being imposed? These questions are central to debates over birthright citizenship, immigration, and even who gets to define what it means to be an American in the first place. So let's dive into it. What makes someone an American? The technical definition of an American: citizenship by birth or naturalization, an ideal of inclusion, and we have this codified in the 14th Amendment. Yet we see attempts to redefine this, most notably through MAGA efforts to end birthright citizenship.
If somebody sets a foot, just a foot, 1 foot, you don't need two, on our land, congratulations, you are now a citizen of the United States of America. Yes, we're going to end that because it's ridiculous.
For those who are still suffering from severe jet lag of 2024 and aren't sure if we're still in 2025 because it was the longest fucking year ever, Donald Trump had reiterated his intention to issue an executive order to circumvent the 14th Amendment and end birthright citizenship. He wants to prevent so-called anchor babies and protect citizens from dangerous illegals. But let's take a closer look. Does this policy reflect safety concerns, or is there something deeper at play here? Remember, the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy led to the separation of over 5,500 children from their families at the U.S. Mexico border in a year. And that was between 2017 and 2018. Now, disturbingly, the administration lacked a systematic process to even track and reunite these families after they went through their due process in court. Scott Lloyd, Trump's then director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, told his staff not to maintain a list of separated children. Additionally, a gentleman by the name of Matthew Albinchi, sorry if I'm mangling that, but he's a piece of shit, so who cares, head of enforcement and removal operations for immigration and customs enforcement, instructed colleagues to prevent reunification even after parents had been processed by our judicial system, stating that reunification undermines the entire effort. Now, how fucked up is that? To date, as of mid-December of 2024, there's still an estimated 1,350 children not reunited with their parents. That's like 30% of the nearly 4,600 migrant children that were taken when they crossed the border just in 2017 and 2018. And I've linked the report to this in the show notes. So, this lack of accountability underscores how these policies fail to uphold basic humanitarian standards, and it shows the profound human cost of using family separation as a deterrent. And in this next segment, it's going to highlight just how fucking stone cold and compassionateless, if that's a word, people have become towards their fellow man, despite being part of a quote unquote Christian nation. So we're going to get into the discussion about whether America is a Christian nation or not. And this discussion has a direct impact on freedom of and freedom from. Now, I would be the last person to be disingenuous and say that America wasn't influenced by Christian principles. But if you're going to tell me it's a Christian nation, forget it. It doesn't matter how many times The word God is mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, or how many states require or used to require a declaration of faith, okay, to hold office. This kind of reasoning just does not fucking fly. Come on now. And I would even say that a lot of the principles we say and can recognize are fashioned after biblical belief systems. These are beliefs and principles that have predated Christianity to begin with. But here's the thing, if we really, really, really want to go down this road, fine. Let's look at the biblical command to love the stranger. It mirrors an older tradition like the ancient Mesopotamian code of hospitality and Confucian principles of benevolence. The Bible also repeatedly calls for compassion toward a marginalized individual and foreigners alike. So, if we're going to be this passionate about having the 10 Commandments in schools and creating policy in government that echoes Christianity, then why are we not following these principles? For instance, we have Leviticus 19:34. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as you love yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord thy God. That is literally coming from God himself. But apparently that's not fucking good enough, and we're going to just let razor wire floating barriers continue to slice and dice people seeking shelter and compassion. What about Deuteronomy 10, verses 18 through 19? He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing, and you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. So not only does he talk about migrants here, he's also talking about single moms and widows. These same people that you feel are freeloading our system. God says, yo, dude, chill out, be empathetic, show some love, because you too were once vulnerable. I'm a fucking atheist. Why do I have to teach you this shit? Finally, let's look at Matthew 25:35. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. That invitation did not require a 40-year-long political game of football about immigration. People have been waiting for the invitation to be invited in for 40 fucking years. So, clearly, and guys, I could pull up at least 6 more scriptures with this attitude. But clearly, even biblically, even according to American Christian standards, empathy and support for migrants, it's not optional. They're central to the faith that are, claiming to be guiding policy in this nation. Yet we are seeing little evidence of these values in modern immigration. Take the ongoing backlash against migrant families bused to sanctuary cities like New York and Chicago. Instead of receiving help, these families were finding themselves in overcrowded shelters with inadequate resources, and it's like a totally stark contrast to being welcoming the stranger. If this nation were truly governed by Christian values, wouldn't love for the stranger and care for the marginalized lead the way? Instead, we've got policies on immigration and education that are revealing something darker, and that's a growing religious tyranny, one that perpetuates exclusion, oppression, and fear of the other, which changes with alarming regularity, by the way. Like today it's migrants. Tomorrow it'll be LGBTQ plus individuals, feminists, dissenting atheists like myself, or the nuns who just don't want to sit in a church pew. The cycle continues, driven by the same exclusionary logic. And here's the thing, if it's truly their illegal presence that's the issue, or the small per capita, violent threat that they risk the community, wouldn't the Christian thing to do is to stop playing political football with this immigration policy and fix it so that we're better ensuring the safety of our citizens and helping those in need? What's stopping us from providing shelter for these people in need while simultaneously reforming the system? Is it really that hard to walk and chew gum at the same time, guys? The truth, I think, is that we could create a process that upholds justice without having to sacrifice compassion. But for some reason, this compassion is being seen as weak. A question that often grabs my attention and really deserves yours is this: why is the Christian political majority, which once prided itself on compassion, now treating it as a weakness? How do we go from a faith that allegedly, emphasize love for the stranger, care for the vulnerable, and the meek inheriting the earth, to one that vilifies the marginalized and punishes the poor. This shift, it's not accidental. It's a response rooted in power consolidation and nationalism. When compassion is seen as weakness, it's easier to justify policies that disproportionately benefit the powerful and divide the nation. The language of compassion, after all, it calls for shared responsibility, equality, a care for the less fortunate, all ideals that stand in direct contrast to the kind of top down power dynamics that are thriving in this nationalistic ideology we're seeing today. Nationalism, especially when it's intertwined with religious rhetoric like we're seeing, demands a singular, uniform identity, almost like a political cult. It isn't about a society that welcomes diversity and differences of opinion. It's about maintaining a homogenous culture that reinforces the power of the few. This is where compassion has become a threat. When a society cares for all its members, regardless of race, immigration status, or religion, it requires resources to be shared and redistributed. It requires systems that don't prioritize one group over another. It demands equity. It demands freedom from. But no, we're currently building a society around the idea that only a certain group belongs or deserves assistance. They're consolidating power by creating an in group that gets the benefits of citizenship, wealth, and influence. You label everyone else as other, as undeserving, as a drain on resources. This narrative justifies exclusionary policies, whether it's restricting immigration, dismantling healthcare, defunding education. By framing these policies as necessary to protect the nation and its citizens from being overrun by outsiders. Christian compassion in this framework is no longer a virtue, but a hindrance. It's seen as an impediment to the vision of an idealized, homogenous nation. When you embrace compassion, you're opening the door to helping those outside your group, and that threatens the ideological purity required for this consolidation. Compassion dilutes control and weakens the narrative of national supremacy. I was just guys, I was in this group chat on TikTok the other day with a good friend of mine named Rick. He runs this business empowerment business. He's an empowerment coach, and literally in the comments on at least 3 or 4 of these lives that I went into, someone would always say, "That's the problems with Democrats. You're compassion. You're weak. You're empathetic. You're woke." Think about the rhetoric surrounding that attitude or surrounding immigration, like particularly under the banner of securing the border. I think this really highlights what this guy was like accusing us of or saying we are. The message isn't about protecting American citizens from danger, though. It's about drawing a line between those who are worthy of compassion and those who aren't. And that is exactly what I'm seeing in comments like, this gentleman that essentially said, "This is Sparta. We don't have time for empathy." And this justification often comes cloaked in the language of patriotism, as though those advocating for humane treatment are somehow betraying the country's interests. This narrative doesn't just push a political agenda, it's about fortifying power, keeping it tightly controlled by those who define what America really is. But here's the issue. This approach isn't in line with the Christian values many of these political figures are claiming to uphold, or the values that these same folks are praying and crying to while they're at church on Sunday. The teachings of Christ, love thy neighbor, care for the hungry, welcome the stranger, they're inconvenient when you're more concerned with consolidating power and ensuring that the in group maintains control. Compassion under these circumstances becomes a weapon to be used against those who would threaten the ideological purity of the nation. You see, for many of these Christians, they're going to say, "Well, we've already been compassionate. We've already allowed you to exist. But now you're putting your business in our face and impeding on our lifestyle, demanding to have a level playing field. So we have no choice but to remove our compassion." Do you see how fucking ridiculous this attitude is? And if you're someone who thinks this way and you're listening to this podcast, do you understand what I just said and how utterly ridiculous that is? How entitled that is, how supremacist that is. Ultimately, when we treat compassion as a weakness, we're ignoring the core tenets of a faith that these political figures and their followers often claim to represent. It's a form of manipulation, using religion as a means to justify exclusion and division. Freedom of. Now, I don't know about you, but the question I'm asking is, who does this consolidation of power truly benefit? And at what cost? Okay, so let's dive into the next part of this podcast today, and that is the abuse of freedom of. Now, clearly, this is not a new phenomenon. Throughout history, the concept of freedom of has been co-opted to justify oppression like time and time and time and time again. We've, understood that the language of liberty and freedom manipulated to mass exploitation, exclusion, and violence is an often recurring pattern. So let's dive into some real examples here. I'm going to start off first with Bible and religious freedom. Okay, it's one of the oldest and most powerful tools of manipulation, in my opinion, ever. And not just the Bible, like religious texts in general. Now, the Bible has at different points in history been used to justify slavery, violence, the exclusion of entire groups. Hell, in the pre-Civil War United States, Christian slave owners leaned on scripture to argue that slavery was divinely ordained. They interpret passages like Ephesians 6:5, slaves obey your earthly masters, to reinforce a system that dehumanized millions. They claim that the freedom of religion gave them the right to practice their faith as they saw fit, unimpeded by those who sought to end the brutal system of slavery. But what they often, I would say conveniently, overlooked in their interpretation was the core of the Christian message: love thy neighbor, care for the poor and oppressed. By distorting the Bible's teachings to suit their desires for power and control, they perpetuated a system that was anything but Christian in its nature. This abuse of religious freedom didn't stop with slavery either. Throughout history, religious institutions have claimed the freedom to define morality, impose those definitions on others, including witch hunts, the persecution of heretics, or the exclusion of marginalized communities like women and LGBTQIA plus individuals. In these instances of freedom of, it wasn't about liberation. It was about consolidating power and justifying tyranny under the guise of religious virtue. But I know you're probably sick of hearing about slavery, right? Seems like everyone is quick to use it as a talking point and counterpoint to justify absolute heartless and apathetic attitudes towards fellow man. But yeah, if we're going to do the opposite and show how it's been used to abuse, oh no, 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 I'm so sick of hearing that. Why is it always about race? So baby, I'm going to take you back to medieval England, okay? We're going to go over church and state collision in that wonderful land. So let's go back to medieval England, where the church and the monarchy were often one and the same. The church was backed by royal authority, and it wielded its version of freedom of religion to impose a rigid, oppressive social order. The laws were simple: either you conform to the church's teachings and practices, or you face persecution. Like, we totally don't hear that today, right? Now, the church's ability to define what was holy gave it the power to control not just religious practices, but also aspects of daily life. See, disobedience wasn't just a spiritual crime, it was a political one. Does this sound familiar yet? So, in this period, the idea of religious freedom was used not to guarantee a diversity of beliefs, but to crush dissent. The Inquisition, for example, it used the authority of both church and state to torture and execute those who were seen as heretics. We kind of see that today politically. The so-called freedom of the church allowed it to marginalize entire groups of people, whether Jews, women, or anyone considered an outsider to the established faith. We're just going to justify the violence and exclude this as a divine retribution. The idea of freedom was twisted into an instrument of oppression used to enforce conformity and control. I know, let me guess. That was England. That's not America. Fine. How many of you listening are so proud of your heritage and like to brag about being part of the Pilgrims? So let's go to the Pilgrims in America and their fucking double standard. So, as you know, the Pilgrims arrived in America, it was like early 17th century. They were fleeing religious persecution in England, like we were just fucking talking about, and they sought the freedom to practice their faith without any interference from a state. But when they established their colonies, they were quick to impose their own brand of religious tyranny on others. They created laws and rules that were just as oppressive and probably more so than where they had fled. Freedom of religion in this case became a tool to enforce strict, homogenous belief systems and to exclude those who didn't conform. For instance, the Pilgrims and the Puritans were notorious for persecuting Quakers and other dissenters who didn't follow their interpretation of Christianity. They even went so far as to banish individuals from their communities or subject them to public punishment. The same freedom of religion they had sought for themselves was used to justify their own religious police state, suppressing any deviation from their narrow worldview. So again, freedom of religion wasn't about the freedom to choose faith. It was about creating a society where only their version of belief could flourish. Are we making the connections here yet? I'm talking to you, MAGA. Now, let's get serious here. I'm going to jump forward to a more recent time, the 20th century, where many of us have recent memory. Or hopefully we've been exposed to the actual history and not the revisionist shit that's being passed around in schools. So let's talk about the civil rights era, where segregationists invoked freedom of association to justify the systemic violence and terror they inflicted on Black Americans. The idea was very simple. If someone didn't want to associate with African Americans, they had the freedom to refuse. Does this sound familiar with trans, LGBTQIA+, same-sex marriage, and Muslims and immigrants? Any of this sounding familiar yet? Now, this was framed as a defense of individual liberty. Sound familiar? But in reality, it was a way to maintain the status quo of white supremacy. Now, white supremacists, I want to say particularly in the southern U.S., I'm in Louisiana, argued that freedom of association, it gives them the right to deny Black people basic human rights, such as access to public facilities, voting, even the ability to live without fear of someone burning down your entire, town. So yeah, the law was skewed to give these oppressive forces the power to exclude, terrorize, and marginalize entire communities based on race. And just as before, freedom of was used to perpetuate injustice under the guise of protecting individual rights, when in fact it was about upholding a system of radicalized oppression. I know you're saying to me, what has this got to do with religion, right? Well, in this case, a lot of the post-restructionist South, okay, was still alive and well. This is the 60s, so, great grandma and great grandpa remembered the good old days of having someone take care of the farm and all this other stuff, slavery. In the civil rights area, many Southern religious leaders, many of whom were Protestant ministers, played a key role in defending segregation. They literally argued that this was divinely ordained and in line with Christian principles. They took the Bible's teachings on race and freedom to fit their agenda. They claimed that the Bible justified the separation of races. They literally cited the passage about the curse of Ham and misinterpreted biblical story to justify this enslavement and marginalization of African Americans. Today, churches were the center of political activity. Segregations rallied under the banner of Christian values to maintain racial inequality. They argued that the freedom of religion guaranteed by the Constitution meant that they had the right to govern their lives how they saw fit according to their religious beliefs, which they claimed included the segregation of Black people. Religious leaders wielded this authority in the name of God to maintain social control, and they did this also to protect a status quo that kept Black Americans, marginalized and oppressed. This manipulation became a driving force in justifying the legal and social exclusion. Okay? Southern churches literally supported Jim Crow, and they even participated in enforcing it through their influence on local and state policies. Think about the Christian denominations in the South that resisted integration of schools. They argued it was against God's will and that a Christian nation was inherently a segregated one. They conflated the protection of religious freedom with the preservation of a racial hierarchy, okay? So, just as white supremacists in the South used freedom of association to marginalize, these religious interpretations girded this system of oppression as well. The notion of freedom was not about liberty. Again, it was about maintaining a power dynamic that favored white Christians and kept everyone else at the bottom of the social economic ladder. Christian policymaking in this case literally perpetuated injustice, claiming it was personal freedom and ignoring the core, again, about equality and love and justice for the marginalized. Are you getting the point yet? Is it sinking in? Just in case, we're going to go take a walk through 1930s Germany next. So in 1930s Germany, everyone knows that the Nazi regime used freedom of religion and twisted it in with religious nationalism. This laid the groundwork for unarguably the most brutal and horrific regimes in human history. The Nazi Party used religious rhetoric to galvanize the Christians within their base, especially the Protestant Germans, to support this nationalistic agenda. And they promoted a national identity rooted in this distortion to unify the population under the banner of Christian values. And these values were selectively applied and severely misinterpreted, of course. I hope you're drawing some parallels here. Now, the regime, trying to consolidate this power, used a lot of exclusionary policy. Hitler and other leaders frequently portrayed them as defenders of Christianity in their speeches. They claimed they were fighting to protect the Christian character of their nation. They used the term freedom of religion to hide the underlying racial and religious purity they were trying to impose. Sound familiar? Now, manipulating Christian symbols and values helped them create a facade of like religious legitimacy. Trump Bibles, anybody. And this radical ideology that they were pushing. In fact, these policies explicitly frame the protection of the Aryan Christian. This is an identity that is essential to part of that national mission they had. Churches opposed Nazi policies were often silenced, and church leaders, at least in the beginning, they either supported the party or they were just intimidated into complete silence. At the same time, they were also weaponizing the concept of freedom of religion to justify systemically excluding and persecuting Jews, Romani peoples, disabled individuals, and other minority groups. Their propaganda machine showed these groups as threats to the purity of the nation, falsely claiming that these outsiders were corrupting the way of Germanic life and twisting and pervading, poisoning true Christian faith. This is crazy. I'm talking about this. People are just not making the connections here with MAGA culture. The rhetoric of freedom of religion here was so twisted, okay, that the state was able to argue that it needed to protect the nation from these supposed internal enemies. Oh, sound familiar?
No, they've done very bad things to this country. They are indeed the enemy from within. And
in this case, for the Nazis, it was Jews who they felt were religious and racial outsiders. But in the dark context of freedom of religion, okay, they justified creating laws that restricted religious practices and cultural freedoms for Jews and other minorities. For example, the infamous Nuremberg Law of 1935, these were grounded in the idea of preserving the freedom of Germans to practice their religion and culture unimpeded by foreign influences. This perverse interpretation of freedom, this led to the widespread disenfranchisement and dehumanization of Jews, Romanis, and others, which ultimately turned into the Holocaust. The Nazi using this freedom as a cover for their policy of religious and racial purity. Again, this was not about liberty. It was, again, another power consolidation move to create a racially homogenous, ideologically pure society. It was a nation state that, under the guise of freedom and protection, stripped away the rights of entire populations because of their ethnicity and beliefs. This distortion of freedom is a powerful example of what religion can be used how it can be used when you're co-opting it as part of a political force. The Nazis didn't care about religious freedom for all. They cared about preserving a national identity that was exclusive, violent, and rooted in dangerous racially defined Christianity. Now let me guess, you're sick of hearing about the Hitler card being pulled, the racial card being pulled. So let's just go right into the moral majority of the 1980s. Now, I'm a Gen X. I was born in 1977, so my memories of the 80s are most prevalent probably from 1986 and on. But I do remember this movement because of my Pentecostal evangelical upbringing in the 1980s. Okay, Jerry Falwell and a bunch of other religious figures, they created what was known as the moral majority. And this was like a political movement that was blending in conservative Christianity with American politics. Again, under the guise of freedom of religion, they pushed to impose a set of Christian values on our nation with a particular focus on marginalizing the LGBTQIA plus community. And this was again a battle to preserve the traditional family and biblical values that they argued were under siege because of the growing visibility and rights of the gay community. You have to understand that Falwell and the moral majority, they were not about protecting individual liberties in a pluralistic society at all. They were trying to assert dominance and control, and they were using religious freedom as a shield to continue pushing an exclusionary vision of American life. Falwell's rhetoric was extremely dressed up, and he used language of faith and morality, despite his desire being rooted in who should be able to participate in society and under what terms. His vision of America was one where anyone that was not within his narrow evangelical Christian framework, they were just immoral and sinful, but they also did not deserve basic human rights. And one of the key elements of this movement was the reinforcement of binary heteronormative concepts of family and gender roles. Sound familiar? Nancy Mace, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Falwell and his allies, they were aggressive when they were advocating for these laws and policies that denied rights. And they wanted to, make sure they couldn't get married, adopt children, or even exist without some type of discriminatory fear. However, this fight really wasn't only about the LGBTQA plus community. It also was about regaining lost political power and social influence from the civil rights era in the 60s and 70s. You see, Falwell's Liberty University and the broader moral majority, they lost their tax exempt status in the early 80s, maybe late 70s, because of their increasingly political activity. Falwell had focused his shift from a broader agenda of controlling public policy, and he wanted to highlight a deeper underlying effort to reassert Christian dominance in the public sphere, particularly in the southern states, because they're most favorable to Christian nationalist agenda. So, in the aftermath of losing his tax exempt status, he began to focus more aggressively on embedding religious conservatism into political decision making, especially in the U.S. South, like I was mentioning, where segregation efforts had once been the status quo. Falwell was always a vocal critic of government policies promoting integration in public schools and for civil rights for people of color. But with the moral majority losing its status as a tax exempt organization, he and his cronies began to embrace new ways of consolidating power, especially if they could foster a toxic blend of religious nationalism and regional white identity politics. So Falwell's freedom of religion argument, when you really look at it, was really not about liberty at all and about ensuring that white conservative Christian values, once again, were the dominant force in shaping American culture and politics. And I think we could look at one key example of this shift is how the moral majority were advocating for school vouchers. And this is very relevant to today because school vouchers, they wanted them to fund private religious schools, okay? And these private schools, which many of which were in the South, were historically known for being exclusive, especially when it came to black students. And the system was also a way to maintain this segregation under the guise of freedom of choice. Again, this should sound really fucking familiar today. Now, this move, I mean, you could frame it as a defense of religious freedom with the idea being that parents should be able to send their kids to school that reflect their values, okay? But in practice, it was really only allowing for the continuation of a system where wealthy, predominantly white families could opt out of the public system that had become integrated. This is where Falwell would argue was not only a religious duty, but a protection of family values. And the consequences for this, was clear. I mean, these schools perpetuated inequality and segregation. Now, at the same time, Falwell again was promoting policies to marginalize LGBTQA plus individuals. Like they would use the language freedom of religion to justify opposition to same sex marriage, adoption rights, and workplace protections, like I mentioned earlier. And what they did was is they framed the gay community as a threat to religious values and the traditional family. It wasn't simply about like saying no to same sex relationships. It was about making these people outsiders as threats to the moral and cultural order that Falwell and his group believe would and should be in control of America. So there you have that. Okay, again, consolidating power in a system that excludes and marginalizes because a certain group or people don't fit within a very, very, very specific vision of America. All right, so let's hop into today's freedom of situation. Let's talk about freedom of education, freedom of an immigration, and freedom of when it comes to gender rights. All right. Right now, we're still seeing a pattern of using freedom of to justify harm. And we're seeing this affect countless areas of public policy right now, including education, immigration, and gender rights. Politicians and advocacy groups use the language of freedom of choice, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, okay, to push policies that often serve to marginalize, exclude, and harm vulnerable communities. Let's take a look at how they're using freedom of education, okay? And freedom of religion, of course, is all wrapped up in this freedom of. One of the most contentious issues I think that we've really seen has been, book banning and controlling the curriculum in public schools, especially when it comes to LGBTQIA plus issues. Now, politicians and school boards, especially in conservative states like Louisiana, have been saying that, parents should have the freedom to protect their children from harmful or inappropriate content. Now, these packaging these laws up in all of this pretty gold wrapping and saying, look, parents, we're trying to ensure your rights. And doing so, we're going to go and erase the existence of gay individuals and issues from the classroom. Okay? So, 2022, I think many of us remember the infamous Don't Say Gay law that was passed in Florida. And this basically says, look, you can't talk about sexual orientation or gender identity in schools. And Ron DeSantis, justified this by saying it was necessary to protect kids from exposure to ideas that he and other people in his politics believed were inappropriate. Basically, he was saying that he was intending to ensure that parents have the right to raise their kids. While it may sound like a reasonable assertion of parental rights, this law silences gay students, teachers, and families because they're saying, hey, you can't talk about these topics in the classroom, okay, regardless of your age or maturity level. You're allowed to exist, but don't let us know you exist, okay? The freedom of argument here is essentially you're going to marginalize like the entire community along with access to children to understand these perspectives and experiences. And this isn't just confined to Florida. Texas back in 2023 had implemented a policy saying that books that were deemed sexually explicit, especially focusing on, gay characters or themes, they could be removed and should be removed from, public school libraries and whatnot. This policy, again, is advocating for freedom of choice, but it's disproportionately targeting those within the gay community, okay? They're ensuring that these students who are LGBTQIA plus never see themselves reflected in the media content and curriculum that they're consuming. This ban is a classic example of freedom of being imposed as a singular conservative worldview, just to remove content that challenges or broadens that worldview. Of course, we can go beyond the implications of how this impacts students and educators. It's also reinforcing the stereotype or the idea that those who are part of the gay community are an other, putting them to the margins of society instead of contributing members. Okay? This claim that they're protecting children being invoked is controlling narratives, it's shaping minds, and it's promoting a worldview that anyone that's not heteronormative or within a cisgender framework is undesirable, immoral, and a danger to society itself, which can lead to a lot of poor behavior by society and communities. We see the same problem with freedom of immigration, okay? This freedom of has also been distorted and weaponized to justify policies that dehumanize and harm migrants. We talked about this earlier, okay? President Trump, one of his key examples of misusing freedom of was his zero tolerance policy back in 2018, okay? This resulted in the separation of families at the US Mexico border. And the policy's justification was framed as a way to protect the national security and uphold the quote unquote rule of law. The government, they argued, had the freedom to protect its borders from illegal immigration. This separation was devastating, okay? But it was framed as a deterrent, hoping to discourage migrants from attempting to cross the border. But it was also to enforce stricter immigration policy at the cost of violating basic human rights to tear apart families. They're imposing physical and emotional trauma on innocent children, okay? And remember, then President Trump defended the policy, saying we have to have a strong border, we have to be strong on immigration, and by claiming that the freedom of the nation to protect its borders took precedence over the lives of families fleeing violence, the Trump administration turned immigration into a political weapon. The cruelty of these policies was presented as a necessary step to ensure security. But no, in truth, it was just attacking human dignity under the idea of national freedom. These policies reflect an obsession with maintaining racial and ethnic homogeneity within the U.S., a desire to control who is allowed to belong to the nation. The justification of freedom is used to obscure the cruel realities faced by asylum seekers, and the insistence on security as a priority serves as an excuse to strip people of basic rights, leaving them even more vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. I think one of the most freedom of religious rights lately has been with the ongoing battle for gender rights. We have a big, big problem in this country with those who do not fit into our perceptions of what is or is not morally acceptable. We see laws in states like Arkansas, Florida, and Alabama that, don't just like prohibit people from accessing care, but they're giving permission to communities to refuse to recognize the identity that someone has chosen for themselves. But they expect in return for this marginalized person to recognize their religious beliefs and systems and values regarding identity. I mean, right now, religious schools and healthcare providers can discriminate and have discriminated against transgender people under the claim of religious freedom. This includes refusing to provide health care, deny admission to students, and refuse to call a transgender person by their chosen name. A name! Like, how harmful is this? A name! These actions, dressed up as protecting your religious freedom, they're actually a direct attack on the basic rights of a person to exist and to be treated with dignity. These policies use freedom of as a cloak to mask the ongoing oppression of marginalized groups, okay? The narrative of protecting freedom is becoming a cover for further consolidation of power and ideology, and political leaders are still using this to weaponize religion and other cultural values to make it easier for them to deny equality and perpetuate inequity. So here we've come full circle. We've walked through so many eras in time just so we can get a better idea of how freedom of is abusive and manipulative without the counterbalance of freedom from. Without freedom from. Trump's education policies, defunding the Department of Education while funneling money to religious schools, is going to deepen inequities. His rhetoric on immigration stokes fear and prejudice. It mirrors the horrors of Japanese internment camps. But this isn't just about Trump. It's about the black and white thinking that drives these policies to begin with. Okay, so let's confront the gray. Let's get into this black and white thinking and why it feels good. The point is, it's rooted in confirmation bias. Studies have shown over and over again that humans gravitate toward information that reinforces what we believe, even when it's wrong. For one, I feel like there's this addiction to conflict and division that we're in at this point. Like, America is like really stuck in a cycle of this prejudice, misperception, fallacious reasoning, online polarization. And I think that this is amplified because we have a thriving online ecosystem filled with platforms and communities that profit from driving this animosity. I mean, think about the recent years. Like, we've even seen this in Hegseth's confirmation hearing, this rise of warrior culture. This ranges from red pill ideology to alt right forums, where, those who are following this content are encouraged to see themselves as soldiers in a never ending culture war. They're the groups who are being emboldened by digital anonymity. They have this environment where rage has been monetized, amplified, weaponized, and it's for political gain. Online platforms such as Reddit, YouTube, Twitter, these have turned culture wars into entertainment and commerce. Channels that dedicate to red pill culture, this is associated with anti feminism and men's right activism, if you aren't aware. These are growing in popularity and profit, even with younger generations. These spaces often, they breed toxic masculinity. Just look at how much money the influencers make off of ads, just by stirring up resentment and creating an army of followers that also see themselves as these warriors to fight against these perceived social threats, which are further reinforced by politicians, whether it's feminism, progressive policies, or changing a demographic landscape. Okay, this constant drip of contentious content, it's perpetuating a narrative of victimhood, and it's also strengthening a sense of belonging and purpose for these groups. It's really a disgusting cycle that, if any dissent is brought the opposite side of the spectrum, it almost results in a call to arms, like literally. And then you have the monetization of these ideologies, okay? This makes it really hard to break the cycle. When you have content creators pushing divisive rhetoric and they get rewarded with views, engagement, and sponsorships, it normalizes exploitation of very real insecurities and frustrations that their audience is experiencing. And they're just feeding into this narrative that the other is always the enemy. And the only way to reclaim freedom is through confrontation, online or in real life. These communities thrive on outrage and the promise of validation, creating really harmful echo chambers where differing opinions are a threat, not an opportunity for dialogue. So, what happens when there's no other left to target? Okay, this is something I'm always asking. Where is this internalized anger and resentment that these online cultures promoted going to go? Often it goes inward. And as our country, is going to continue to be divided and marginalizing other groups within the same cultural and political space, there's going to be a lot of clashing. There's going to be, even more toxicity in online forums and in the streets. It's going to leave the wealthiest and most powerful completely unscathed, though. The poor, desperate for answers, are going to turn on each other. And we're already seeing this. We're already fighting over limited resources. We're already fighting for social recognition. And while the structures that benefit the elite are going to continue staying untouched, despite all of this online and public rage. Everyone is so wrapped up in their specific ideology being the only one to follow, being the only one to save, American culture, that they're failing to realize that all of us together can have the same thing and coexist because the government's convinced them that this is not possible. And their political leaders have given them the green light to lash out their disaffection against the other. Okay, so it's time to wrap up this podcast. I think if you haven't gotten the idea, maybe you've at least gotten an understanding of what's going on in this country and maybe why, if you're a MAGA, those on the opposite side of you and even some in your own party are having a problem with the policies and the behavior that we're seeing from the incoming president that we saw the last time and everything else. But again, there's this delicate balance between freedom of and freedom from. We often think of freedom as the ability to act as we wish, pursue our desires without interference. But freedom isn't just about what we can do, it's about what we are free from. Freedom from oppression, freedom from fear, freedom from discrimination. These are just as vital to a functioning society as our freedom to express ourselves, to choose our beliefs, and to act on them. But it's still time you've got to acknowledge that true freedom doesn't come at the expense of others. When one group's freedom to act becomes a denial of another group's freedom from harm, we're no longer upholding liberty. We're perpetuating injustice, and that often manifests in forms of inequality. For those of us who hold privilege, whether based on race, gender, socioeconomic status, or any other factor, it's critical to recognize that this isn't just a personal success story. Our freedom often and regularly comes at the cost of others. Acknowledging that is not about guilt, it's about responsibility. It's about stepping up and making the commitment to share the proverbial toy, as the metaphor goes, so that everyone else can play too. So, what can you do moving forward? In what ways can you balance your freedom with the need for collective freedom? First is recognizing your privilege. Acknowledge where you hold privilege. It could be your race, your economic status, your ideology, your ability to access resources. This is, again, not about guilt. It's awareness and understanding how it's shaping your experience. From there, you can begin to identify the ways in which others may be deprived of similar privileges. Actively listen and learn, too. Instead of assuming you know what others need, listen to their experiences. Seek out the stories of marginalized communities. Learn from their struggles. Understand that your experience isn't universal. Also, you have to start advocating for equity, not just equality. Equity means that everyone gets what they need to succeed. Sometimes this means giving more to those who have been deprived. It's not about oppressing anyone, it's about ensuring that everyone has the same opportunity to thrive. Equity is not about giving everyone the same thing, it's about providing each person with what will allow them to reach their potential. Hold yourself accountable as well. Accountability, I mean, that's just key here. It's easy to say you support fairness, it's way harder to act on it, especially when it requires you to give up something, whether it's power, resources, comfort. So start small. Support policies that promote equity. Engage in conversations that challenge your biases and how you think beyond your own experiences. Be willing to examine your bias and make changes in how you treat others based on this. And then you need to understand the collective good, guys. When we work toward a more equitable society, it's not about harming anyone or stripping them of their freedoms. It's about ensuring that no one is left behind. Like, I can't say this enough. Making room for others to have the freedom they deserve benefits everybody in the long run. A society where everyone has access to resources, opportunity, and justice, it's healthier. And it's a stronger society for everybody. So, in the end, balancing freedom of with freedom from, this isn't about making one person less important than the other. Okay? We're just making sure no one's freedom is built on the impression or exclusion of others. True freedom is collective, not individualistic. No more me and mine. It's about lifting each other up so that everyone can be truly free. Catch you next week. And I hope that this gives you something to think about. Feel free to send me an email, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Remember, you can catch all of my episodes at www.mogpodcast.com. That's mogpodcast.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite platform where you get your podcasts.